Welcome everybody to today's National Institute for Literacy's webcast, Getting Reading Results in the Classroom, What Research Tells Us. My name is Brett Miller. I'm the Program Director for the Reading, Writing, and Related Learning Disabilities Research Program at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, or NICHD for short. I'm excited to be moderating today's webcast that's focused on disseminating research findings from several multi-year research projects funded by the National Institute for Literacy, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Vocational and Adult Education, and the NICHD. These projects investigated the development of literacy skills in learners enrolled in the adult basic and secondary education classrooms. These projects were supported as part of a broader consortium of research projects that focused on critical factors influencing the instruction and development of literacy competencies in adults, and to determine the most effective instructional methods and program organizational approaches for adult literacy programs. During the discussion, the panelists will be summarizing their specific research projects, information about study participants, and important findings coming out from these projects. With that in mind, let's introduce our three distinguished adult literacy research panelists. First, we have Dr. Charles Skip MacArthur. He is Professor of Special Education and Literacy in the School of Education at the University of Delaware. Next is Dr. Daphne Greenberg. She's an Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and Special Education at Georgia State University. And at the end, we have Dr. Daryl Millard. Dr. Daryl Millard is Associate Research Professor at the University of Kansas. For those audience members who are interested in learning more about their backgrounds and the research conducted by our three distinguished panelists, please go to www.nifl.gov and click on the link to today's webcast. Importantly, those of you participating in today's webcast will have an opportunity to interact with our panel members through a Q&A format. We're interested in hearing your questions about this research and encourage you to submit your questions during today's webcast. So please use the Ask a Question button. It is the thought bubble icon above the media window to submit questions for the panelists. As I'm assuming is the case for all of our participants, I'm really interested to hear from our distinguished guests. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started then. And so what I'd like to start with is by asking each of today's presenters about the goals and motivation for their projects. So let's start with Skip and work around the table. So Skip.
Thank you, Brett. Well, the main purpose of our project was to develop and evaluate a curriculum for teaching decoding to adult basic education students. It was motivated by a previous study completed by my research associate, Judy Allen-Prez. In that study, they investigated, it was a descriptive study. They looked at adult education participants from 30 or some programs across 16 states around the United States and followed their progress over the course of a year. And they found that the students did make modest but significant educational gains during the course of that year. They found further that students who were in programs that provided structured reading instruction focused on decoding and comprehension, those students made greater gains than students that were in somewhat less structured instructional programs. However, the instructional programs that they were using had not been designed specifically for working with adults. They were adapted from curriculum developed for working with younger students. And in addition, those programs were designed with the idea that students would have a lot of time available, as they do in elementary school. And the students in the adult programs did not have anywhere near that amount of time due to attendance problems and scheduling and so forth. So our goal was to develop a curriculum that was specifically designed to be used in adult literacy programs and that would meet the needs of adults and be designed to be as efficient as we could possibly make it.
Thank you, Skip. And Daphne?
Thank you, Brett. We had two major goals in our study. The first goal was to understand basically the strengths and the weaknesses of adult learners who read at about the 3rd to 5th grade levels on word reading identification tests. And we wanted to see what were their strengths and weaknesses on all kinds of reading processes. The second aim of the study was to investigate what kind of reading instructional approaches would best work with this sample of adults. Our motivation really came from the fact that there isn't a lot of research out there on what works with adults and what are their specific strengths and weaknesses. In fact, if you look at the literature in the 1980s, there's a real outcry from the field and from researchers that we need a lot more research on what adults bring to the classroom, what are the best approaches to teach them, and so forth. So we were motivated by the lack of research in order to conduct our study. And what we decided to do, as Skip had mentioned, that there is very, very little out there that we know about adults and interventions and instructional approaches, that we would look at the children's literature. And what we found was that with typically developing children, what seems to be important is to focus on all kinds of component skills, such as decoding, sounding out words, fluency, reading accurately and quickly, and comprehension, being able to understand what one reads. And then we also decided to test out an approach that focuses on wide reading, exposing students to a lot of literature. And as we go on with the rest of this panel, I will give more information and details.
Great. And Daryl.
Well, as my colleagues mentioned, we've got a great deal of information about children's development of literacy, and more limited from the point of view of adults. So overall, we were interested in what's the parallel between our models of children's literacy, children's characteristics related to literacy, and then how that parallels participants in adult education programs. So if we take that as the overall view, we had more specific aims. The first aim was to describe what are the demands or the task characteristics that adults need to perform in their reading. So we know that when they enter adult education programs, they take placement tests, so, for example. So what are the requirements for a student to do well on those placement tests? And the second, well, what's the profile of those adults in adult education programs, adult basic ed, adult secondary ed, on the components that are commonly associated with reading proficiency. The second aim was that we knew we had interventions that were effective with children, students in high school settings, for example, from a cognitive strategy model. So did those successes, would they transfer, would they parallel and work well with the same level of efficacy in adult education programs? And then the third area was to say, if we can demonstrate their efficacy of those interventions, would they also be effective when we implemented those in typical adult education programs, and could those interventions be implemented with fidelity? So overall, that's what we were after.
Great. Well, with all this in mind, I'd like to open up a question for all of you. And essentially, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us about the particular adult learners in the study, and also what your sense is of the extent to which the adult learners you studied correspond to the broader group of learners in your area or across the country. And for this one, I'd like to start with Daphne.
Sure. About half of our students were African American. Another quarter were Hispanic, and about 12% or so were Asian, the rest Caucasian. And they, about close to half spoke English as their second language, but they were able to speak English well enough so that they were able to participate in instruction that was purely in English. Close to 70% of our sample was female. The average age was in their 30s, with a range from about 16 to 78. And then the last demographic that I'll report on today was that they self-reported that they had attained about a 10th, on average, about a 10th or 11th grade level of education. And the sample does seem to be representative of the programs from which we selected our students from.
Great. And let's proceed and go to Daryl next.
Sure. If we look at OVE's reports of who participates in adult education programs, there was a close parallel to our sampling of adult education participants as well. In that descriptive study, we included approximately 300 learners. We took 50 learners in each of those 6 NRS reporting levels. So we had very beginning through that group that was working on their GED completion. in that sample, because again, we wanted to look at the profile of those learners across those different levels. And then our learners may have had English as a second language, but they were not participating in an ESL program at the time. They may have previously, but they had moved into adult basic ed or adult secondary education. So briefly, that's an overview.
Great. And let's give Skip a chance.
We studied adult learners in 23 adult education programs from 12 states around the country. And the population was fairly typical of those that have been described by Daphne and Daryl. We had perhaps slightly more white students. About a third of the population was white, 20% African American, about a quarter of them Hispanic, and then quite a few Asians as well. Two-thirds of the students were born or educated and were primarily native English speakers, and the other third came from other countries, though we didn't include any students in classes for speakers of other languages. So they all had sufficient command of English to participate in English reading classes. One interesting thing is that of those students who were born or educated in the United States, 50% of them reported that they had had a learning disability when they were in school.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so again, this question is going to be for all three of you. And what I'd like each of you to talk about is, based upon your research, what can we say at this point about the literacy strengths and challenges facing adult learners, and how might this inform practice or administration in a broader adult literacy program site? And why don't we start this one with Skip?
Okay. Well, in part of our descriptive work, we looked for subgroups of adults, and their adults' skills vary widely. There are a lot of different patterns of reading skills. Some students have better decoding skills than others. Some are better with comprehension. And so we tried to look at subgroups, and we found quite a lot of diversity. One noticeable thing was the difference between students who were native speakers of English and those who were not. They represented quite different patterns of skills. In general, students who came from other countries had relatively better decoding skills and weaker comprehension skills than the students who had gone to school for their entire life here in this country and still had difficulty reading. Those students, by and large, struggled greatly with decoding skills. So it's important to keep in mind that those different profiles and different patterns of learning in planning instruction.
Great. And why don't we mix it up a little bit and go to Daryl, then to Daphne?
Well, I'll work up an answer then. Let's see. So picking up on Skip's point, I want to emphasize that the diversity of population also reflects a diversity of abilities. And to say that a person is enrolled in adult education is really more of a programmatic label than having value for instructional purposes. For example, that adult ed enrollee may be an immigrant from another country who's completed a professional degree, but needs further work maybe on the English side or reading comprehension skills in English. Another adult education enrollee might be that high school senior who, for one reason or another, left school and just didn't get the diploma. So he or she is back ready to complete perhaps that GED set of tests to complete the degree. And then the third example would be the 16-year-old, the youngest age group in our sample, who left high school perhaps for a host of social, familial, employment reasons. Maybe was a push out, if you want to think of it that way. But we need to think of, as Skip was suggesting, the difference of profiles of these individuals and the skills and abilities that they bring to when they come to our adult education programs when we begin thinking about then that instructional planning. Yeah, I'll stop at that point because there's
great.
But
and let's go to Daphne.
Sure, thanks. I think what I'll do is I'll focus more on the specific challenges that we found with our students who are reading at the 3rd to 5th grade levels. They had challenges in all kinds of reading areas, but the 3 that really stood out the most were in the areas of being able to sound out words that they had never seen before, understanding words and oral vocabulary, so understanding words that are spoken out loud to them, and then in fluency, whether it's fluency of reading words that they already knew, words that they might need to sound out, or actual sentences. And so it would seem that, well, of course, a teacher of these learners needs to focus on all the aspects of reading, that it may be especially appropriate to focus a little bit more on decoding, fluency, and vocabulary for this group. Also, attendance is a big issue for our students. It can be very difficult for them to come to classes, as we all know. But one thing that I would like to note as what I saw was a particular strength was the motivation students had to come to our classes. We met 4 times a week for 2 hours each class, and by the time we were done, we actually had a whole group of students that made it through for an average of 94 hours. And to me, that really speaks to the strength that some of the students have in terms of figuring out a way to get to class to work on something as important as reading.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, for this one, let's start with Skip. And what I'd like to do is have you speak a bit about what some of the challenges facing researchers when considering how to develop interventions in an adult basic or secondary education context. And with that, Skip.
Okay, thanks. Well, there's a number of challenges, and we'll kind of divide them up here. But one of the challenges is that there isn't very much research on the reading skills of this population. And so when you're trying to develop an intervention, that's a problem, because you don't have the information you need to know exactly what to target. We did know that we were targeting decoding skills, but even there's a lot of variation. Adults in this population tend to have better word recognition skills than they do decoding skills. They can read a lot of sight words, but they can't decode the words. So for that reason, because of that, we started out with a series of small design studies to try to figure out what things would work best. Another challenge is the extreme diversity of the group. I think we already mentioned this as we talked about our populations. But again, that's a problem when you're designing an intervention, because you have to provide sufficient common instruction for the class to move forward, but at the same time have ways of differentiating for individuals who have different sets of skills.
Okay, great. Let's transition and give Daphne a chance.
Thanks. Yes, I'll quickly touch upon 2 issues that, of course, are very familiar to our adult literacy practitioners. One is the whole notion of space, and as adult literacy practitioners struggle with finding space for their classes, for one-on-one counseling, for maybe library space, kitchen space, etc., it's very hard when a researcher wants to come in and then devote an allocated space to a class, a research class, or to testing and so forth. And then the other issue has to do, once again, with attendance issues. Just as it's difficult for a teacher and the learner to move forward when learners are absent quite frequently, it also creates a lot of havoc for the researcher who really needs the data to be collected in a consistent manner. So I think that those are 2 issues that are of no surprise to our adult literacy practitioners, but also affect researchers.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is also give Daryl a chance to reply as well.
Well, clearly the points that Skip and Daphne have raised are central to our work as well. What I'd add is the diversity of the goals that the learners bring. If we reflect on the profiles that I offered in previously, they're attending for a variety of purposes. Maybe it's to improve literacy for work-related. Maybe it's to complete that high school diploma. Maybe it's to be able to support a family member, helping a child with homework, for example, or just being able to read to a youngster. So if we're trying to craft interventions that speak to the variety of goals, in a sense, we're imposing our goal on the learner, and that's going to create some difficulty. And I see that as Daphne's referring to attendance issues. We want to be sure we can get as close of a match as possible. Because we have a protocol that we want to follow. We want the learners to come, as you said, 4 days a week, 2 hours a day, and that's what we need to test the efficacy of our intervention. So, we've got to sell this idea as well to those participants to be successful. Well, anyway.
Great. All right. Then what I'd like to do at this point, I think, is ask each of you to describe the goals for your interventions, and discuss outcomes from the intervention work and other analyses that you might have been conducting within the scope of the broader project. So for instance, having completed the study, what were the successes and challenges that might inform how we think about goals for future interventions? And so with that, what I think I'd like to do is start with Daphne. Daphne?
Thank you. So we, as I already mentioned, we were focusing on different instructional approaches. Our classes met 2 hours every day, Monday through Thursday, for an opportunity of about 100 hours. We offered classes on decoding and fluency, decoding comprehension and fluency, extensive reading, decoding comprehension, fluency, and extensive reading. And I'll explain that in detail in a moment. All of our approaches, except for the extensive reading, were very explicitly taught with a script. So the teacher basically knew exactly what to say, when to say, how to say it, and what to cover each day. The extensive reading approach did not have that kind of script. It was more what's called implicit learning or teaching. In the decoding, the students that received decoding, they worked on learning about letter-sound combinations, word endings, irregular words, reading stories with words that they already knew. The students that focused a lot on comprehension, what they got was background information, vocabulary, learning how to take information from a paragraph and do something with it. So, for example, how to use analogies, how to understand directions, what to do about contradictions, and things like that. Students that received a fluency aspect, they received a passage which they read aloud to their teacher, and then what happened was they would go back and work on it privately until they could read it 40% faster than what they could do it the first time, and of course with accuracy. And finally, in the extensive reading approach, students had a large library of books, high interest, low vocabulary books, which basically means books that are written at levels that they can read, but that they can also would be appropriate for adults, that we would all be interested in reading. And they spent a lot of time in silent, sustained reading, where they read silently to themselves the books that they had chosen. And there was also a read-aloud activity where the teacher read out loud a book while the students followed in their own copy, and it was typically a book that the students could not have read on their own. And then there was a lot of book discussion. So what we found at the end of our study was we did a whole series of different kinds of analyses. And in the first analysis, what we did was we just put everybody, all the data in one big analysis without regard to approach. What we wanted to see was, do adults improve in general who are reading at this grade level? And we found that they made some gains, maybe smaller than we would have hoped for, but they did make gains in the areas of word reading, of sounding out nonsense words or words that are not real words, passage comprehension, and fluency. So they made some gains in those areas. We also wanted to look at what were the differences in terms of gains for students for whom English was their second language versus for whom they were native speakers, once again without regard to approach. And we found one difference was that the non-native speakers made a little bit more gain on their ability to sound out words. When we looked at instructional approach to see if that made a difference, we were surprised to find that it did not. And so what that tells us is that basically the take-home message is, yes, adults can learn to improve their reading skills, but we still have to do a lot more research to really figure out what is the best approach to use.
Yeah, great. And let's go to Daryl.
Okay, so when we looked at our groups of learners in, this would be learners in levels 3 through 6 participating in our interventions. Overall, we did not demonstrate the efficacy of our interventions. So that was a major disappointment. We saw individual learners who benefited, and I was really quite astounded because it just looked like we should be able to knock the socks off of any of our measures because I thought of the quality of the instruction and the explicitness and so on. But it came down to looking at the dosage. And I'll cast that in two ways. One would be the individual participant in the instruction was much less than what we would want to be able to see effects. That is, 26 hours doesn't get you an effect. So there, on the individual level, individuals were not participating long enough. And then the other side of the dosage is also programmatic. That is, if our programs offer classes on a very limited basis for only so many weeks at a time, specified hours of the day, in a sense, we're reducing the opportunities, the learning opportunities for our adult education participants, and thus that reduces the dosage that they could eventually receive as well. We looked at interventions from this cognitive strategy model on word analysis. We looked at fluency, and we looked at 2 strategies to improve reading comprehension. Again, it was kind of that we knew those interventions are effective in more traditional school settings like in high school. So we thought, well, here we know they'll work, but apparently not in this setting, not with these circumstances anyway. So that's kind of the short story. But if I was going to offer the instructors a bit of advice, I'd emphasize the need for fluency, not as the fluency as a reading component, but that the learners become fluent, if that's in decoding, if that's in word analysis, if that's about phonemic awareness, if that's about using a comprehension strategy. Know the steps. Be sure you're fluent in the skills associated with those reading components. I think that's where I put my money these days.
Okay, great. And what I'd like to do now is give Skip a chance.
Thank you. Well, our project focused on developing a curriculum for teaching decoding specifically designed for use with adults. It's a highly structured program, and it's designed to be used as part of a full balanced reading instruction program. So teachers used all the instruction was done by regular adult literacy instructors in their classes, in classes for low intermediate adult basic ed students, basically 4th to 7th grade reading comprehension level. And it's designed to be used in combination with other instruction they would provide on comprehension and vocabulary development and so forth. So it's a decoding curriculum. And by the way, the materials are going to be available on NIFL's Links website very shortly, free of charge for anyone to use who would like to do so. The theoretical framework for the curriculum was based on Dick Vinesky's work. He was the original principal investigator on the project. And that approach emphasizes understanding the phonological and morphological characteristics of the English language. Briefly, English words are spelled the way they are for a number of reasons. First of all, there's letter-sound association, so that's the alphabetic level. And then secondly, there's a pattern level, because we have words like when you add an E to the end, the vowel changes to a long vowel. So we have patterns. And then the third source of spelling is meaning. And so, for example, simply the ED means past tense, even though it can be pronounced d, t, or ed in different words. And the same goes even more so for large multisyllabic words, where the spelling is very much influenced by meaning components. And we called the curriculum Making Sense of Decoding and Spelling, because we wanted the adult learners to understand that the way words were spelled and what they had to do to decode them made some sense. And so we systematically taught them the most common and useful patterns in English to help them to decode words. We taught decoding in combination with spelling because it's the same knowledge base. They have to learn the same things. And adult learners, we found in our design studies, are interested in learning how to spell words. They recognize sometimes more clearly that their spelling problems than their decoding problems. And so they want to learn spelling. And so we taught the two things in combination, though our real goal was to improve the learner's reading. We started with we used multisyllabic words from the very start. Multisyllabic words do a couple of things. First of all, they force students to use their new decoding skills to figure out how to pronounce individual syllables, which are not real words. And secondly, they make the curriculum more adult and make it easier for the learners to apply it when they go to read other materials. Along with focusing on multisyllabic words, we taught students a metacognitive strategy for approaching the decoding of multisyllabic words, so that to help them take what they were learning in the curriculum and apply it in a systematic and strategic way when they were reading other materials. In addition, we provided some fluency practice. Not nearly enough. We expected that the teachers would continue to provide additional fluency practice beyond the curriculum, but we got them started on it. And the curriculum has 30 lessons. They're highly scripted. They have progress assessments, progress monitoring assessments built in, so that teachers can reteach as necessary. As I said, we did the research in regular adult reading classes with the regular instructors providing all instruction. We wanted to develop something and test it that would work in real settings. We did have modest positive results. We found statistically significant and educationally significant gains on a measure of decoding skills overall between the treatment and control groups. We did not get statistically significant differences on word recognition or fluency or vocabulary or comprehension. However, on the decoding, word recognition, and spelling measures, all the differences did favor the treatment group. The effects were somewhat different for the native speakers and the non-native speakers. The treatment had a relatively greater effect for students who were native speakers on word recognition skills. So we haven't interpreted exactly what that means. We have our ideas about it, but we can't really figure them out quite. Another message, which is similar to what Daphne said, is another message beside the difference between the treatment and control. Other message is that overall, when you combine all the students, whether they were in treatment or control, they did gain. They made significant gains in nearly all the measures that we used, and this is with only 60 hours average of instruction between pre-test and post-test. So they do make progress, but we need to learn a lot more about how to design instruction that's specifically adapted for these students. So we need to continue working on that. Another issue is that the non-native and native speakers made different gains. Overall, when you combine them, the non-native speakers made substantially larger gains than the native learners on decoding, word recognition, decoding and word recognition. So this may be related to the fact that the native speakers, well, they were already in school in English reading classes for 12 years, most of them, and they still didn't learn to read. So many of them have learning disabilities that are interfering with their development of reading skills. Non-native speakers, many of them have difficulty because they don't have the background or the language skills to do it. So they're different populations, and we need to do more. We didn't solve this problem, but we need to do more to differentiate instruction among different learners in general, but in particular between those who are native speakers of English and those who are not.
Great. All right. My sense has been in the research community, we oftentimes, or maybe sometimes get the opportunity to discuss key issues and kind of next steps in moving forward. And my sense has been that this occurs far less when we're talking with practitioners and having discussions with them. And so what I wanted to do is to give each of you an opportunity to discuss what you see as some of the key issues and challenges that the field needs to tackle in the coming years. And kind of with that in mind, what I thought I'd do is have Daryl start this time. Daryl?
So key issues. I believe we have enough emerging data to suggest that the child model, the children reading acquisition model, isn't parallel for adults. that we see adults having a different pattern of reading acquisition. And briefly, one difference would be that when we look at children, about the 3rd or 4th grade, they have less reliance on that decoding. They've got a sight vocabulary that helps them read, and they make that connection then with language, and then language supports their reading development, reading comprehension. And we didn't see that shift in our adult learners, and I think it's the point where we don't, the fluency question comes up, that they aren't particularly fluent in the word analysis and the sight word, even reading prose in a fluent manner, nor fluent in comprehension strategies. So that I would see from an instructional point of view as something for us to pay attention to. Now, the implication of that for our assessments are the placement tests that we use, they don't inform instruction. And it seems to be that's where our reliance is on a TABE, on a CASAS, on an ABLE. And that doesn't give us sufficient information for instructional planning. So we're in this conundrum of needing to do more specific diagnostic assessment, if you will, for these learners. And as Skip mentioned earlier, we have a limited pool of validated interventions for this population. So what do I go to the shelf to use with these learners is going to be very limited. The implication being we need to be, or my assumption is then that we need to be very explicit at what we use for our interventions. We use frequent progress monitoring measures. We remember the diversity of this population that we talked about at the very beginning. It's diverse in goals, they're diverse in abilities with multiple profiles of learners as well. We don't know how much gain a learner needs to make to have a practical difference in his or her life, or I don't believe we do. So to demonstrate gains on a test to move from one level to the next, fine, that's administrative. But what does it mean to that person in real life is a question. We don't have a learning trajectory for these adults. We know what reading acquisition looks like for 1st grade or 2nd graders. We know how many words they can learn per week. We know what to expect. We don't have that trajectory for these learners. So I think it's difficult for us to have good perspectives on appropriate interventions for these learners. And then also matching those interventions with assessments that will be sensitive to change. Our placement tests aren't sensitive to change. All right, I'll stop.
Great. And why don't we move to Daphne?
Sure. I actually want to piggyback off of one of Darrell's statements, which was about the whole notion of what does it mean when we move grade level with our students. And I absolutely agree. What does it mean moving a student from a 4th grade level to a 5th grade level in terms of their actual practical day-to-day activities? And not only that, but the whole notion of grade level is based on what we know about children. And I think we're all finding that the models that we know about based on children don't necessarily work as well as we think they should with the adults. And so should we even be using the grade level concept? But anyway, moving on from there, I guess I have 3 points that I would like to focus on. One is that I think it's clear that adults who attend adult literacy programs can improve their reading skills. The key is that we really haven't figured out yet what is the best approach to use with the adults. And as both Darrell and Skip and I have mentioned, there's great diversity. And so it may not be one-size-fits-all type of approach. Along that, and in addition to that, not only do we have to figure out what is the best approach, but they don't have a lot of time. Adults don't have a lot of time to devote to educational needs. And so not only do we need the right approach, but we need to figure out the right approach in very little time that the students have to be in the classroom. And then thirdly, I think something that practitioners and researchers can really work together on is to figure out what is the best what should we be doing when the student can't attend class or just isn't in class for whatever reason? Is there stuff that we can help them do, whether it's a workbook they take home, whether it's a book to read that they take home, a newspaper, whether it's something online that they access, but how can they independently continue working on skills so that they're not so dependent on the classroom situation, and that they become more lifelong learners, which I think should be the ultimate goal of what we're doing in adult literacy programs.
Great. And Skip?
Yeah, those are both wonderful comments, and again, I can piggyback on what Daphne and Daryl have said. Particularly with regard to the issue of the instructional time that's available. And we set out to design a curriculum that would work for adults to teach decoding, and we had at least some modest success, though not nearly what we hoped to have, but we at least had some modest success with it. But we didn't see any carryover to reading comprehension. So now why is that? Is that because there wasn't enough time? We didn't develop the fluency, as Daryl mentioned, that they could figure out the words but not fluently enough for it to affect their comprehension, so it's just more time and more practice. Another possibility is that the curriculum wasn't sufficiently integrated. Right? So we put in these components, the strategy to help students decode words while they were reading other things. We encouraged fluency practice, but maybe we didn't take advantage of some of the possibilities for integration that we could have. So we're teaching about multisyllabic words, but we didn't take the opportunity to teach vocabulary at the same time. So that might have enhanced both the word recognition and the vocabulary learning. So perhaps better integration of the instruction would help, and that takes, again, a lot more instructional development. And then the third thing is just individual variation. You guys talked about both. We need to do a better job of assessing the needs of individual students as they come into the programs and periodically throughout their instruction, so that we can target decoding instruction or vocabulary instruction to those who need it the most.
Okay. I want to actually follow up a little bit on a point that Daphne raised. So while you guys were talking, I'm also scrolling and looking at the questions that are coming in online while we're talking. And one of the sets of questions that we're seeing coming in has to do about this issue of what can learners do outside of the context of a classroom, given some of the challenges of the amount of time that we need, learning time we need in the classroom. What sorts of activities or technology or other resources might be best or potentially effective for these learners outside of the learning context? And given that
Sure.
you mentioned it in yours, I thought I would start with you and then kind of transition to Daryl and Skip if they have any suggestions.
Yeah, two ideas pop immediately into my mind. One is that if you have a library in your classroom full of those high interest, low vocabulary books, I really would recommend having students take these books home to read. Practice is really important, and so the more they read texts that they can read, the more fluent, the more automatic they're going to become, their comprehension should start to increase, and so forth. So I think that that's definitely a habit we want to try to teach our learners to get into, because a lot of them don't have that habit. They're so used to not being able to read that they haven't been exposed to adult books written at levels that they can read. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of them appreciate being able to take a book home and being able to read on the bus or on the subway or while they're waiting in the doctor's office. The second idea I would suggest is that now there is actually more availability of computers and the internet for our learners. A lot of adult literacy programs now have it. A lot of libraries have free access. A lot of their children's public schools have parent resource rooms that often make computers accessible to parents. And so, if some time in class can be allocated to teaching students how to access the internet if they don't know how to, and where to find perhaps some sites that they may find interesting and so forth, so that they can practice going on the internet, working on some of those reading skills and so forth using the computer, I think that would be very beneficial as well.
Okay, great. And I'm not sure if Daryl or Skip, if either of you want to add anything?
Well, I was going to suggest more outside reading, that's the best thing that you can ask students to do. to take home, and not just to read, but also while they're doing it to apply the things that you've been teaching them. It's a way of providing integration between the skills you're teaching them and the opportunity to apply them in real reading. In addition to using online material and technology, there's a world of assistive technology that hasn't really been tapped for use with struggling readers. So, widely available tools now that will read text to students, so that if they've taken stuff home to read that, perhaps there's a few words in it that they can't decode, the computer will do that for them. And also, I think it's important as they read to ask them to do something with what they read, not just to read it, but to answer questions about it, or summarize it, or in some way process that material so to increase their own ability to check whether they're understanding what they're reading.
And I believe that should be very explicit. I'm all with you. Encourage them to read. But there seems to be two pieces here. One is, if I'm not a good reader, I probably really don't realize where I am on the scale, and so I don't read. Our younger folks were reading more magazines. Our older adults in our sample were reading more work-related documents. So they read different, but they don't appreciate maybe how much more there is that's available to appreciate from prose, reading prose. And thus, one would be for instructors to help build that and say there's another world out there that's available to you as you become more fluent. And the second is being explicit, as Skip was suggesting, using maybe concept maps, webs, to help them make the explicit connections on what's on the History Channel or Animal Planet or CNN News, with other concepts. Background knowledge generally was very low in our sample. So we have to build this conceptual foundation as well, and thus making that more explicit. Temporally, sequentially, cause and effect. Those are elements that could be incorporated from that reading that they're going to do independently. All right, I'll stop.
If there's time, I completely agree with you. I think that television is a completely untapped resource. And if they can be alerted to educational programs, if they don't know about them, the Animal Channel, Discovery Channel, and so forth, they really can be building up their background knowledge, which will eventually help them make sense of what they read. And two other quick points that came to me was, a lot of our learners don't realize that their public libraries, many of them, not all of them of course, but many of them actually have sections full of books that are high interest, low vocabulary. So to help them get a library card if they don't have them, introduce them to those books and so forth. And then the last point is that for parents who have very young children, to encourage them to read to their children, easy to read books that they can read, because first of all that fosters intergenerational literacy, but is another way for them to practice reading and to also set an example for their children.
Great. One of the thematic questions that's coming out from here is talking about this issue of difficulty getting time constraints, kind of in line with the last one. And one set of questions has to do about comprehension. So given the time constraints in the classroom in terms of teaching comprehension, are there certain strategies or approaches that you would recommend, that a shorter list that could help instructors focus on what might be the most effective for those sets of learners? And so you can take it for a subset, or you can take it for the full set, depending on what you want.
So what would be a good comprehension activity to develop? So paraphrasing would be, we've read this, put this in your own words. What does this mean in your own words now that we've read this section of text? That would be one example on. And what's curious, I believe, what I like about that strategy of asking them to paraphrase and pick out a couple key details is that it asks them to elaborate based on their previous knowledge, what they currently know, and then also bridges to what else was in the paragraph, or what else they had read previously. So when Joe Magliano, for example, in his research says, well, when we looked at text processing, there are these two elements that we have to work on, bridging and elaboration. Well, it gives you an opportunity through paraphrasing to work on making sense of this whole passage, as well as my link to what I already know about zebras or fly fishing or growing flowers. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that while you're doing that, you can also, instead of just also looking backwards in terms of background knowledge, you can look forward in terms of predicting.
Yes.
So after they paraphrase and connect it to what they already know, you can have an activity which maybe even you read the next line of the next paragraph and say, okay, now we know what it was said in this paragraph. We have the first line of this next paragraph. What do we think this next paragraph is going to entail? Or if it's a mystery, I wonder who did it, or whatever it is. But I think that those three activities, connecting background knowledge, paraphrasing, and predicting, would hopefully be an activity that can be accomplished within a short amount of time.
Well, let me just jump in and add one more, and that's asking questions. So if you can't read effectively, part of what good readers do is they go along and they ask themselves questions. If you're reading fiction, oftentimes the authors deliberately leave out information to force you to ask questions, to wonder about what's going to be happening next. And certainly when you're reading informative text, lots of questions come up that haven't been answered, and learners sometimes feel that they must have missed something if they don't understand it, but that's not the case. They just need to learn to ask those questions, hold them to the side, and maybe the answer will come along.
And the teacher can also model. Because
exactly what I was going to say.
Ahead.
The other thing, there's lots of strategies that you can teach, but important to think about how you're going to teach them. So critical elements in teaching strategies. First is to be very explicit. We are learning about paraphrasing. Name the strategy, explain what it's all about. Second, model. You got to show students how to do it, right? So if you want them to learn paraphrasing, then you need to read a paragraph and think through out loud the process that you use to come up with your paraphrase or to come up with a question. And then third, lots of guided practice where the students try it, the learners try it, and then they explain to you why they did it the way they did it, and then other learners jump in. You can do this in a small group where you take turns trying to apply the strategies. And as an instructor, you're there then to provide support and help them to do that successfully. And they need a lot of practice to do it. So those three things, naming and explaining the strategy very explicitly, providing modeling by thinking through yourself how to do it, and third, providing lots and lots of guided practice until students develop the ability to do it on their own. And if you do that, any of these strategies will contribute to students' reading comprehension.
And I just want to stress about the modeling, because you had mentioned about questioning.
Yes.
And a lot of our students feel like they should know. And if they don't know, it's because they're quote-unquote stupid or something. And so to have a so-called expert reader model that they don't know, then it teaches them, oh, we're not supposed to know everything. The text is specifically ambiguous for everybody. And I think that that's something that they need to learn, that no, the text isn't as explicit as we would sometimes like it to be. There are a lot of questions that all of us would have.
That's a very good point, yeah.
Great. One thing I do want to mention for those of you who are listening today is that the transcripts to today's discussion will be available on NIPL's website following the meeting, so you don't have to scribble down notes very quickly and can focus on what our three distinguished speakers are saying. One thing I did want to hit on, and this is something where we've also received a number of questions, has to do with individuals with disabilities. And
we're only taking easy questions.
Easy questions, yeah. Yeah, and unfortunately that one snuck in. So, but it has to do with how effective the instructional approaches that the three of you have used were for the individuals with disabilities in your samples. I realize, Skip, you had a larger percentage than Daryl and Daphne did, so I'll start with you if that's okay, and then have the two of you add to that.
Yeah. I don't know that I can specifically say which strategies work better with students with disabilities. The only interaction that we got between our instructional program and the outcomes was on word recognition, where we found that the students who were the native speakers gained relatively more from the instruction than the non-native speakers, and that may be related to the fact that many of them had learning disabilities, whether they knew it or not. But they'd been to school in the United States for many, many years, and they still had difficulty reading. So it's at least conceivable that they had some sort of a learning disability, even if they had never been diagnosed. And the very explicit instruction is typically beneficial to students with disabilities. But I would think it would be to the entire population. Since they're all struggling readers, I don't know that I would say which, perhaps the word recognition decoding stuff is more important for students with disabilities.
Well, we didn't find any differences in terms of instructional approach and whether somebody self-reported a disability or not. So unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of information for that answer.
Well, our interventions were built on the strategy model that Skip just did a wonderful job of elaborating on the critical steps there of learning strategies. And so those strategies, such as the paraphrasing strategy, had all been developed and validated on students with learning disabilities in high school and middle school settings. So we didn't differentiate in this work. We didn't disaggregate our data on disability, but the foundation was all for students with disabilities in school settings. So that's how come we know they work. Okay, stop.
And we're also getting a fair number of questions regarding availability of publications coming from these studies. So one of the venues that's available, at least for the more recent journal publications that have come out of these studies, is, and we're talking primarily ones that are published in late 2008 moving forward, is there's a site called PubMed, which will make the link to it available from this webcast summary that provides free access to journal publications, generally about a year after the publication has been published. But these are freely available on the web for those of you who are interested. I believe some of you also have some materials that might be of interest to the audience. I know, Skip, you had mentioned the curriculum that's forthcoming.
Our curriculum materials, called Making Sense of Decoding and Spelling, will be available on the NIFL Links website very shortly. They're fully developed, and there's just a couple little polishing to do, but very shortly the materials should be available. They're free for anybody to download and print out and use in your classes.
Great. So I want to hit on a topic that we struck on a bit earlier, which is the applicability of child models of learning to read to the adult learners that we're serving. And I know Daryl made a few comments to that regard, and I thought this would be a nice opportunity to elaborate on that, because we're receiving quite a few questions regarding how applicable are child models of reading to the adult learners that we're trying to serve here.
Right. Well, when we conducted that descriptive study looking at adults' performance on reading components, we then developed, if you will, a reading model that incorporated some cognitive processes such as memory, phonemic awareness or phonological processing, word analysis, vocabulary, listening comprehension. And when we conducted those analyses, our models were different from the children's models. And that's, so we're coming at this from the point of view of, on our commonly used assessment, they presented a different profile than what children typically do. And fundamentally, again, one of those critical elements is that our adults were not making the shift from kind of that word level analysis and word level reading to integrated with language, so that their language knowledge would then support their reading comprehension, develop their reading skills. So I took away from that well, one could be, the cognitive mechanisms, the executive functioning, the self-regulated learning, the working memory and such may be different for these adults. But from an instructional point of view, looking at the reader's limited fluency, for example, in decoding, and I don't mean fluency as a reading component again, but their proficiency, that the automaticity, that would be our better word, the automaticity of sound symbol associations and such, and word recognition, so that they're more labored in their reading. Thus, if I'm more labored, I can't comprehend. I'm spending more time trying to figure out what this text is saying to me than being able to put it together and comprehend, integrate, bridge, and elaborate. And I have more difficulty with that because I'm spending more energy, mental energy, or reader resources, as some folks would say, on more that word level and phonics level and phonemic level. So that's the basic framework. You guys probably...
Yeah, no, we definitely found the same kind of results when we tried to simulate child models and see if we could compare them to what we found in our data. But one thing I think that I want to stress is that not only are our adults weak on certain skills, but their skills aren't integrated. They're not working together. So, for example, if you take a child who's reading at the second grade level, a second grader who's reading at the second grade level, and you test them on all their different skills, and they're reading and they're performing at the second grade level, what we see in the literature is that their skills are working together. There's somehow there's some automaticity involved, and we're not finding that with our adults. So there really are two major issues. One is the difficulty they're having with the specific skills, and the second issue is the interconnectivity, basically, of the skills, which really gets to what we were talking about in terms of fluency and automaticity, that these things are not working as fluidly as we would want and hope for.
So they're not efficient then.
Yes, thank you.
Right?
Absolutely.
We don't become efficient, and then our effectiveness goes down.
Right. So no matter what grade level you're reading at, you're not efficient at that grade level.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think they did a wonderful job answering that question.
Great.
Skip the next one then.
Actually, the next one's going to start with Daphne. Yeah, sorry, Daphne. We've been getting a number of questions asking for additional information about the sets of interventions that were completed. And I was wondering if each of you could speak in a little more detail, like in your case, for instance, kind of what kinds of comprehension, fluency, word recognition, and phonics approaches were taught.
Yeah, and I'm so glad, thank you to whoever asked that question, because I forgot to mention that the decoding and comprehension came out of the SRA McGraw-Hill corrective reading program. It's a commercial program that you can look up on the web and get information about. The fluency was your basic guided reading approach. And the extensive reading was modeled after Krashen's work, Krashen, who wrote a lot about how to develop extensive reading classrooms.
Did you want to add anything there?
Well, again, our intervention work was founded in the work that folks at KU's Center for Research on Learning had done. So work that Don Deschler and Gene Shoemaker, Jan Bolgren, Keith Lenz had completed over so many years and validated as effective. So essentially what our task in moving these to adult education was to say, well, we have a different class structure, so we know we need to change these interventions a bit to make that work, or hopefully make it work. But that's the origin of that. And so information's available from the Center for Research on Learning at the university.
Skip, did you want to add anything?
Well, as I said, we developed the curriculum basically not from scratch, but from the theoretical framework and from other work. It's related in some ways to other approaches that are based on a phonological, morphological approach to teaching decoding and spelling. like the work that came out of University of Virginia, starting with Henderson. Some of you may be familiar with Words Their Way, which is a very popular approach and program used in elementary schools. So that's based on a similar sort of understanding of the developmental framework. And of course, our materials, as I've said, are available for people who want to try them out.
But
Yes.
let's go back and remember, our findings, for our study, were very modest. I mean, we didn't get large group effects. So while I'd love to say, oh, go get this and use it, no. One has to seriously stop and think about how would I make changes so this would be worth the time of the learner. The principles are solid, and again, we know that they work in other settings, but clearly we have to do something different in this adult ed setting. And maybe it's, Skip, you made the point earlier about the multiple profiles, the diversity of our learners. Well, we did a cluster analysis as well and found remarkable differences. I can imagine that these would be best used with learners who were at levels 5 and 6. You know, when I think about our learning strategies
Grade
approach.
levels 5 and 6.
No, NRS
levels.
National Reporting levels of 5 and 6. So they're pre-GED, they're GED at that point. Because those folks generally had integrated the reading components and the language processing, if you will, to be more successful. So that's the guidance I'd offer.
Absolutely. Yeah, we wouldn't want anybody to run out and say, oh, now we know which approach to use. That's far from the truth at this point.
Right. And we had positive effects, but they were relatively modest. But we did find effects on decoding. And if you're going to use it, you just have to be aware of the importance of integrating that decoding instruction with instruction in fluency and vocabulary and comprehension, because it's not a comprehensive program. In terms of level, it's really targeted on individuals at that low intermediate level, reading 3rd grade, 5th, 7th grade. And it would not be suitable for beginning readers because it focuses at a higher developmental level.
Yeah.
It's a basic review of very basic phonics, but it gets quickly into multisyllabic words and patterns and morphological patterns. So, but I think for that one group, it's one model that's worth trying.
So. Okay. We're going to shift gears a little bit. We're getting a lot of questions regarding to an earlier topic that we hit on, which is access to materials, reading materials, so books and other sorts of content for these learners. And I know you had mentioned, Daphne, about the possibility of the resources available potentially at your local library. And I had wondered, amongst the three of you, if you have some suggestions for these practitioners on where they may be able to find reading materials that would be appropriate for these learners and of high interest for these learners.
Okay.
I know that's a difficult question.
Well, actually, I can supply NIFL/links a website where they can find examples of books where they can that they can purchase for their students, high interest, low vocabulary. I guess this would be a question, and Brett, I don't know if you know the answer to. I can think off the top of my head 2 publishing companies that publish books, but I'm not sure if right, and I probably shouldn't. But I think on the website you'll see examples of where you can get books like that.
Okay. And Daryl or Skip, do you have any other comments?
Well, part of this descriptive study was looking at what our adult ed participants were reading. And from an ecological validity point of view or practice, they were much more focused, for example, the younger group, on magazines and periodicals that, on the newsstand kind of information. I'm sure scholarly journals too. Okay, no. All right. So the everyday popular magazines, but then our older adults, meaning past age 24, were more likely to be reading documents, work-related materials, And so that would have, I think that's real important for us to pay attention to. Again, because they have such diverse goals. If I came in wanting to help my child learn to read, well, maybe that's the kind of material, children's literature, I might use that as the means to the end here.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, if you wanted to work on fluency with some adults, you could have them come in and repeatedly read a children's book until they can do it fluently with expression, and then take it home and read it to their kids.
Exactly.
They'd be highly motivated, and that would develop their fluency.
We should start them with Old Man in the Sea, shouldn't we?
So one other question, and this one is admittedly a fairly difficult question, that's coming in pretty consistently, has to do with assessments. Because we've talked a fair bit about the potential value of assessing, but also some of the challenges given the instruments that we have available now. And I was wondering if each of you could speak a little bit to some of the assessments that you were using in your study, if they're appropriate or not for the practitioner context, or if you have any suggestions given some of the challenges and limitations with what we have currently available.
Well, one thing I would say is that we definitely need a lot more research in terms of how the tests that we use work with our adults. There is a problem. If you want to analyze adults who read at very, very low levels and have, so to speak, very low-level reading kinds of skills, unfortunately there aren't really tests out there that tackle it at such a low level for the older adult. So, for example, a very commonly used test might test how the students blend sounds together. But if it's only been normed or validated on adults who, on individuals up until the age of 21, we don't necessarily know for a fact that the test can work the same way with adults who are older. But we have to deal with what we have, and so that's what we do. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a potential complication that we just like we talked about, we need more research in terms of what are their strengths and weaknesses and what kinds of approaches work the best. We actually also need research in terms of the actual assessments that we use.
I'd like to draw a distinction between using tests to find out what students' level are and develop profiles. And so we can say, that this student really needs a lot of work on decoding skills. So that would be initial assessment when they come in. And the assessments that you need to actually plan instruction. So diagnostic assessments or more informal assessments. So you've decided a student needs work on decoding. Well, where am I going to start? That's a big area. So you need to know, can the student decode words with short vowels? What long vowel patterns is a student mastered so that so you need to know exactly where in a reasonable sequence. And so the one way to do that is through spelling assessments. So the developmental spelling assessments, like the one that Kathy Gansky has. So she has a book on spelling development that I would recommend. There's an excellent assessment in there that's good for your own learning as instructors to understand the development of spelling and decoding skills. And also it's a very useful assessment tool to see, because by finding out what students can spell, is a good guide to what you need to teach them in decoding. And then similarly you can use the same sorts of, having informal tests that have students read words that are initially phonetic and then pattern words and then multisyllabic words to find out where their decoding skills start to fall apart. Then that helps you decide what decoding skills to teach. And I guess the same would be true in other areas with comprehension, or you want to find out what it is that students are capable of doing. Decoding just happens to be very specific, where you really need to know in some detail what individuals can do in order to make your instruction efficient.
And there are two resources that I just thought of that might be helpful to our listeners. Off of the NIFL Links website, there's the McShane book, M-C-S-H-A-N-E, which really lays out a very nice examples of of assessment tools and how to translate what you learn from the diagnostic kind of work that Skip is talking about to actual instruction. And then also the exact name of the website is escaping me, but I think it's fairly easy to find.
We'll post it too.
Yeah, okay. Also on the NIFL Links website, which is basically a skills and profiles kind of website where they give a whole bunch of different examples of free ways to assess students in terms of the diagnostic stuff that you're talking about, and then how do you actually then map their profiles and what it should tell you in terms of instruction.
And then there's NIFL's STAR program, right, which I guess is not accessible to everybody, but if your state participates, I'm not sure. I think the STAR reading program has a lot of assessment in it, suggestions about doing diagnostic assessment.
Yeah. And I want to say, I'll double check, but I want to say that's also available, information's available via OVE, the Office of Vocational and Adult Education for that. Daryl, did you want to add anything?
I'd add, don't give any more assessments than you are going to use and that you're qualified to administer. The level of assessment we're describing requires skill on the part of that examiner. And so let's be sure we're qualified. We know how to administer that appropriately, how to score. Because if we're talking about decoding, it's an extremely difficult.
True.
Okay, but anyway, those can all be mastered. And then at the same time, we don't know anyone who particularly enjoys taking assessments. We don't, you know, those breathalyzer tests that they always want us to. But anyway, any of those, we don't particularly enjoy those, and so we don't think that adults who are challenging about coming to an adult education program and trying to balance so much will want to spend any more time in assessment than they themselves believe is useful as well. So we need to make this real tight connection of this assessment helps us with this lesson, and we'll be able to assess your progress at the completion of this lesson. And if we're not seeing progress, then we know we need to review more carefully our lesson planning and what we're using, with the choices we have for assessments as well. I'll stop with that.
Okay. One thing I want to hit on that's we've got a number of questions on, and this is probably going to be a little shorter, is there were some questions about the learning levels that your particular interventions are appropriate for.
Yes.
And I was wondering if each of you could revisit roughly the grade level equivalent of the learners that the curriculums are really targeted for, that each of you have been working with. And with that, why don't we start with Skip?
Ours is targeted on lower intermediate level in adult basic education, so students who have some proficiency in reading, but still need work on decoding skills.
And our particular study only focused on the 3rd to 5th grade level reader, but in reality, corrective reading starts at the almost non-reading level and goes much higher up than what we targeted, and the extensive reading can be used at any level.
Okay.
So to translate, our interventions were delivered for learners who were at the NRS levels of 3 through 6, or would have a grade equivalency of 5th grade through 12th grade. That was generally the range. And those comprehension strategies, such as paraphrasing, the prediction strategy, would be targeted for learners at the higher end of those levels. But again, I don't want to recommend, don't rush out and say that those interventions are going to work for you. We just have to be real cautious about this.
Yep.
Well, unfortunately, we're getting short on time now, and I want to thank everybody for all the questions that were submitted, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of those, but I hope that you found the questions that we were able to hit on helpful for all of you. What I want to do is give each of you a chance to hit on some last points for the speakers, or I'm sorry, for the audience rather, on each of your projects. And with that, why don't I start with Skip, since you're next to me, and then we'll move around.
All right. Well, the first thing I want to make, and I think we'll all agree on this, is that it's difficult to do research with these populations. There's a lot of complexity in working out in adult education settings, and so it's complicated to get results, particularly when you're working in natural settings with students. And we found no effects to modest effects across our projects. And so, we did have some modest success with our curriculum and therefore decided to make it available for people. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to improve it, and I hope that as practitioners you will take it and integrate it with the rest of your instruction and use what makes sense and make the best use of it that you can.
And Daphne?
I think I basically just have one take-home message, and that is that it appears that adults can learn to improve their reading skills, but we really don't know yet how to best do it. And especially given the amount of time that can be devoted to instruction, given all adults' busy lives. So I guess my take-home message is, unfortunately, we still need to do a lot of research. And in the meantime, of course, learners and teachers can't wait, because right, the need is now. And so I would really focus on, at least at the grade levels I was studying, the 3rd to 5th, things such as vocabulary, fluency, decoding, and really encourage them to read a lot, as much as they can at home when they're not in class.
Okay.
Oh, what a treat having been on the panel here with this group and this opportunity. So 2 points. One is about the assessment. Recognize that the assessment tasks we have on our placement measures, TABE, CASAS, ABLE, whatever you're using, require different types of responses from the learner. So that has implications then when we plan instruction. So those need to be very conscious choices rather than just saying, oh, the particular score that a learner obtained really doesn't convey to you what you need for that instructional planning. And then second, on the instructional side, when we have this opportunity of working with learners in our programs, make that the most intense, structured, focused, engaged opportunity that you can with those learners. Using that time, whether it's in direct instruction with you as the instructor or as they work with partners, and the point becoming more fluent in those decoding skills that SCIP's curriculum provides for you, or in the developing just the sight word vocabulary, or in learning those comprehension strategies, or in developing vocabulary, as Daphne was describing. So let's be explicit, let's be focused, and let's check on their progress frequently within the
We do, yeah.
One thing that we haven't discussed today, but I know that Daryl and Daphne will agree with me, is the importance of professional development. So we've been talking about reading instruction, and we've been talking about the research that we did on methods for providing effective reading instruction. But the method is only as good as the knowledge of the instructor permits. So you're teaching comprehension skills. There's a lot to know about what goes into comprehension and how to teach strategies. Or you're teaching decoding skills. There's a lot to know. You need to know certain basic things about why English words are spelled the way they are, for example, in order to do a good job with it. And so actually in our teacher's guide we discuss some of those issues that are important to learn about. So it's important to go out and find opportunities for professional development in reading instruction. Get together with a group of your peers who are interested and read some books together on reading instruction and just get together and discuss them. So there's lots of ways to do it, but the effectiveness of the teacher is probably in the end more important than the particular materials or strategies that you're trying to teach. And that effectiveness depends on the teacher's knowledge and skill, which develops over time. So professional development is very, very important.
I want to give each of you a chance to comment on that. Okay. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Skip said about the importance of professional development, but I also recognize that not all programs have funding for professional development. There isn't always time for it, et cetera, et cetera. So I did want to put in a plug for the NIFL links discussion lists, because those are excellent tools for professional development. You can very easily sign up. There's a subscribe button, so to speak, on the NIFL links website. And And there are a whole host of different discussion lists that one can subscribe to. And you can post a question that you might have, a burning question about a student, what to do, and usually you'll get a response. And plus there are often interesting guest speakers on these discussion lists, and I think that that's an excellent way to get free professional development 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's an example.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion.
That's good. Wow,
Do you have any?
I think they've covered this very well.
Great. Well, I'm glad that we were able to kind of hit on this issue because a number of people had asked a bit about professional development, and I thought it was a little unfortunate that we needed to shift at that point, so I'm glad you were able to come back and get a chance to do that. At this point, what I'd like to do is thank everybody for today's lively discussion, particularly our audience members and our three panelists, Dr. Skip MacArthur, Daphne Greenberg, and Daryl Millillard. Unfortunately, though, given the volume of questions, we were unable to field all of them for today's webcast, but we hope and trust that you've left today's discussion with a better understanding of each of the project goals and key findings that have come out of these projects to date. Although we often informally talk about a project being a certain number of years, the findings coming out of the projects continue to emerge. So we'll all need to keep our eyes open for new and upcoming results from these studies as well as others. And I think we'll all leave today's discussion with a better understanding of the literacy needs in decoding, receptive language, fluency, and comprehension for these learners. And it's also important to remember that the needs of our learners are not all the same, and that we should be taking a close look at the importance of assessment and how it's used, whether we're using it for formative reasons or for more summative or entry reasons. To help inform, again, our placement and instruction within our classrooms. And we're also making progress in understanding how adult learners acquire reading skills and how these differ or are similar to earlier acquisition of reading skills, and that will continue to emerge over time. Although we don't have a panacea at this point for all of our learners' needs, these projects and others clearly show that you can improve students' comprehensive reading skills and that students can benefit from instruction targeting their learning needs. The practitioner and research communities really need to be working together to jointly address the needs of adult basic and secondary education students and both their education and their health needs. And these projects are a firm step in that direction. And with that, I'd like to close. And again, I want to thank all of our panelists here as well as our participants who have been listening and watching remotely. And on behalf of everybody at the National Institute for Literacy, I want to say thank you.